Figures from the Met Office put the average mean temperature at 13.1 degrees Celsius. In the city, the FTSE 100 has closed down 8 points at 82.66. The pound buys $1.27 and €1.17. LBC weather, some drizzle in the west and north tonight and a low of 6 degrees. From Global's newsroom for LBC, I'm Daryl Jackson.
This is LBC from Global, leading Britain's conversation. Cross Question with Iain Dale.
Hello, a very good evening. Welcome to Monday's Cross Question. Joining me on the panel tonight, Stella Creasy from the Labour Party, Sir Alan Duncan, former Conservative Foreign Office Minister, Gina Miller, leader of the True and Fair Party, and Anne McElvoy, broadcaster and Executive Director of Politico Europe and host of the Power Play podcast. Got that right, thank goodness for that. They are here to answer your questions. The number to call if you'd like to put a question to the panel, 0345 6060 973. You can WhatsApp us on the same number and text us on 84850 and watch us on Global Player.
Call 0345 6060 973. Tweet at LBC. Text 84850. Cross Question with Iain Dale. This is LBC.
Well, welcome to you all. Let's go to our first question. It's a text question from Samuel, who says, has Nigel Farage just put the final nail in the Tory party's coffin? Let's go to Alan Duncan.
Welcome back, by the way. I was in mourning.
Welcome to you too.
You've been resurrected. It's your Lazarus
bit like Nigel Farage.
No, I think the answer is it's going to be increasingly destructive. It's very self-indulgent. What's the point of having a party that just wants to destroy another party with nothing really
It's deeper than that, isn't it?
I think it's deeper at the moment because it's playing very heavily, understandably, on the Tories having pressed the self-destruct button by scrabbling and scrapping with each other pretty well for the last 8 years. But I think the answer to your question, here's the man. It's slightly sort of Soviet. He's appointed himself leader of his own party. He's appointed himself to the one seat he thinks the party can win without hardly any kind of process. I think your caller earlier said it's not a party. What I think he meant was it doesn't behave like a party with a structure and a broad agenda. But yes, it is going to be increasingly destructive. It's only going to do further harm.
Gina Miller, you lead a party outside the normal range of political parties. It's a slightly awkward way of putting it. But you know what I mean.
Yeah.
I mean, you would die for publicity like this, wouldn't you?
No, because I actually am really worried what they're going to do to the country in this campaign. I think we were beginning to heal. I think some of the divisions are now going to be back where we were. We're going to go back to where we were 8 years ago. I mean, Brexit destroyed the Conservative Party and destroyed our country, and he's back to do it again. And, I think that's what's happened today. And I think the polls today that show the Conservatives winning, or Labour winning 194 seats, I mean, I think Farage is now going to push that even higher now by standing. I think I agreed with two things he said in his press conference today, which you might find odd. One was that there isn't going to be an opposition after a Labour win because the chaos in the Tory party is just going to deepen. And the second thing he said was that he was free to change his mind. I absolutely agree that people are free to change their minds. Shame he doesn't think that about Brexit. Well, you do, but what he doesn't. When it comes to Brexit, he doesn't think people should be allowed to change their minds. But everything else, I agree with. You are allowed to change your mind. I still don't understand when he made the comment that he's going to be in politics for 5 years. So that bit I didn't quite understand today.
Well, I suppose it was just making the point he's not just going to be leader for this election and then disappear again, because everyone thought he would then go off to America and help Donald Trump.
Would you believe him? I mean, he changes his mind just as much as Sunak does.
Well, he hasn't, I mean, to be fair, he hasn't changed his mind on the big issues, has he? I mean,
I meant on standing. No, I meant about standing and not standing, going to America, offering his services to the Labour Party to sort of broker deals with Trump. That's what I meant, that sort of thing. No, he hasn't changed his mind on Brexit, and he, whatever the evidence, he doesn't seem to want to see it.
And I think by 5 years, he just probably meant he was going to serve a parliament, but who knows? And all I'd say is just one more thing, sorry, not to let the others in for a second. If he thinks...
I wouldn't intrude on private grief.
No,
that's fine.
If he thinks that he can be such an insurgent that he can somehow take over the Conservative Party in Parliament if he were elected in Clacton, is so absurd. I think they'll be putting him on a sort of top of a bonfire for Guy Fawkes
But
night before they do that.
I promise to bring you two in just one second. But just to follow up on that, do you not think, though, that if the Conservatives have, let's say the Conservatives have a good week this week and they kind of win the week, and I know it sounds preposterous, but let's just imagine that for a second, and then the polls don't change, the polls don't shift at all in the Conservatives' favour. Many people believe that the Tory party would implode during the middle of an election campaign in those circumstances.
No, I think it's now stuck in a rut. I think the problem is it's going to be very difficult to move anything because unlike any election I've known in the best part of 50 years, this is one where you just feel that people made up their mind before it and aren't going to be shifted by any kind of events. And sadly, the sort of general feeling is you can do what you want, mate, but we watched you for 8 years and we've just sort of fed up with you. We don't think you behaved as Conservatives should. Please go away.
It's 14 years. People want them out.
Well, that's kind of what Alan was saying.
Yeah, I agree.
Stella.
I'm going to be really boring.
Okay, Anne.
Just accused start my campaign.
Stella
I'm going to be really boring because he is the narcissist in chief, isn't he? That's what we're seeing today, that he's gracing us with his presence. I actually think of Clacton. I know Clacton. I spent time living in Essex as a kid. It's a town that needs representation.
We used to go there on day trips to the seaside.
Exactly, Clacton Pier. It's a town that needs representation. And I just think if they actually elect him, that day-to-day thing that is so important to the British system, actually, that you have to be accountable to your constituents, that actually people will come to you about the minutiae of their lives, big and small. I don't see him as somebody who's actually going to put the work in because this is ultimately all about him. The other thing I worry about is absolutely the Conservative Party looks from the outside. I mean, I joke about private grief, but it looks like it's in a bit of a death rattle. But one of the truisms in politics, isn't it, is things can always get worse. We've already seen in the last week a kind of bingo of things designed to appeal to reform voters. I think this is going to cement and bake in what we might call the culture wars, what I just think is incredibly divisive. I mean, last week I was coming up as a joke with kind of things that might come up next from the Conservatives, whether it was, bringing back corporal punishment and invading France and putting Boris in the House of Lords. All of that feels frighteningly true now, because if you are in that tailspin and Nigel Farage has come along to help out, which way are you going to go? And I think there's a real test of character moment for Rishi Sunak to say, actually, enough. This is not going to help people in places like Clacton. It's not going to help people in places like Walthamstow. This kind of divisive politics, this kind of celebritisation.
But it could draw the party further to the right, just when it needs to go the other way.
Exactly,
that's the danger. That's really what you're saying.
That's exactly what I mean. I mean, it is going to end up in this kind of plaintive, no, we're more right-wing, more right-wing. And actually what I think the last week has shown is the public is just going, the answer to the cost of living crisis is not national service. The answer to the cost of living crisis is not actually punching down on universities. It's trying to figure out why our economy is stalling. And I'm with Gina in thinking that things like Brexit are part of that. The one thing I think is good is that I'd finally like to see Nigel Farage being held to account for the damage that he's done to this country, because he's managed to evade it every single time by not winning. So maybe if he wins, finally, he'll have to do the legwork. He'll have to be accountable to people in Clacton. And people like me in Parliament will enjoy, with relish, holding him to account for what he's done to this country.
And McElvoy, let's have some dispassionate political analysis. What does this actually mean for the election? Do you think that it potentially could change the result? Because I think it could. I wonder if you've...
I'm inclined that way. I'm not as heated as everybody else on this panel about Nigel Farage has got a perfect right to stand. And actually, rather he stood than just threw beer bottles from the sidelines. And also, a lot of people don't see the answers. I mean, from what we've heard of a fairly narrow, albeit party mixed panel here tonight, a lot of people feel themselves to be outside that compact. This is not just about the UK and there's the Brexit word, as if that can be blamed for everything. Actually, quite a lot of things are still going out fine in the UK despite Brexit, including actually bits of the City of London doing fine. But it's not the answer, I think, to sort of blame Brexit for everything, blame Farage for everything, when we are seeing across Europe, and remember, we're coming into European parliamentary elections this week at the weekend, I think we will see that shift of parties being challenged. The parties will often come from the right, they will often also come from the left, and that they are saying they are not happy with the compact of politics as it is being offered. So there are very good reasons to think that Farage is not the answer. Yes, he is a blowhard, but I mean, he's actually saying quite a lot of things. A lot of people agree. And there's also just a desire to say, well, this is really bad. like, I can't wait till he's in Parliament so I can kick him, or he won't represent his constituency well, or this has been a very irregular way of going about it, which is also true because Reform is an insurrectionist party in a force. I mean, so is Gina's. Yeah. And in a way, I'm actually rather pleased that we have a bit of rock and roll outside the norms of politics. I don't completely see that blaming Nigel Farage for the fact that the main parties didn't really understand the country a lot in the run-up to Brexit is an acceptable way of looking at it.
So I agree with you. I'm a Democrat as well as a socialist. I want people to stand...
I agree with Nick Clegg kind of point.
No, nobody agrees with Nick Clegg.
Go ahead, sorry.
But where I differ from you is I don't see it as about I see it about holding to account, because actually I do think about people in Clacton who have been let down. I am not here to defend the status quo. I recognise lots of politics problems. Genuinely, I'm sorry that Iain, that you weren't able to go forward, because actually I think we do need
lots
new
of different people in politics.
Yeah, I agree with Gina on that. And as a Democrat, I want well, probably they'd have got somebody better. But no. In terms of guests, Iain, because I can disagree with you, but I can recognise you as somebody who thinks that politics ultimately should be about finding answers. My beef with Nigel Farage is his politics is fundamentally stasis. It's about find somebody to blame for why the world is unfair and use that to grift. And he and Donald Trump are in that exact same situation. They're grifters. This is, if you're ever on the Donald Trump
we're saying, that it's not people
list,
who
want
merchandise. But it's not people who want to mend the country, isn't it? It's not people who want to look at everyday issues.
So what you're saying
I can disagree with Iain, I can disagree with Alan, but I can recognise and respect they have different ideas about the way the country should move forward in a really uncertain time. How we should actually step up to what the public told us by voting for Brexit.
What you're
I don't see that with him.
Stella, is that it's a destructive move.
I think it's all about him. And actually, frankly, in politics, myself included, I'm sure there'll be many people on Twitter who would say this, we've got to move away from the idea that one person is it. That, you know, whether it is the Prime Minister, it's actually about everybody working on these problems.
If I just say one quick thing, I mean, I think there's something much bigger going on here, which is that I think we're seeing a gradual decline of the effectiveness and performance of our parliamentary democracy.
Yeah.
I think we're seeing candidates imposed with very little local participation in terms of membership or selection.
That would never happen in the Labour Party.
We're seeing ministers being increasingly displaced by special advisors in terms of power and decision making. We're seeing the complete collapse of cabinet government, it being replaced by a much more presidential sort of prime ministerial government. And we're seeing people not performing properly in Parliament to make law. They'd rather gob off on social media. That
or
is
present TV and radio programmes.
So, brilliantly like
podcasts.
you.
We've all got a podcast.
But the thing is, the distraction is from politics, though, and policies, isn't it? That's what we want to be. People want to vote about. They want to see what are the offerings.
But
what
it's
are the
a
policy
mixture, isn't
offerings?
it? It can't just be all about policy because people would just switch off and they'd be bored. There has to be a bit of excitement.
But on the doorstep, people want to
Where are the people of substance?
Yeah,
there are so few characters. You hear this all the time when you're talking to people. They say, "Where are the big figures in our politics now?" They don't feel they're there.
But when they get them, they then start saying, "Oh, well, not that big figure." Right? We just
No, they don't.
I don't.
They say, "Where are the Willie White laws? You know, where are the Dennis Healey?"
Well, they say if they're like,
people don't feel that anyone's
certain age.
Hang on. You can't all talk at once because nobody can understand a word you're saying. I mean, Alan, you're just being an old git when you say that there are no characters in politics now. There are. I mean, there are in all parties. Now, you might say, well, there aren't enough of them compared to the 1980s or 1960s.
They're characters, but I'm talking about people who I think invite confidence and are substantial figures, particularly in terms of policy and running their departments. Of course, there are people who are characters, because we live in a media world, so there's going to be no shortage of them. The question is, are they really people of substance when it comes to having an effective government which is actually making it work well?
It's a frightening thing that I find myself in full agreement with Alan. Very strange. Fundamentally, and you kind of said it earlier, you know, the people of Clacton should matter in this, and I just think their interests are better served by grafters rather than grifters. And what I see in Nigel Farage is a grifter, and actually what I think every community deserves is a grafter who will get into Parliament and work to make change happen, so that in 5 years you've got a track record to point to, not just a great radio show or TV presentation. You know, like,
I mean, he's a
actually
big
the
figure,
substance
but what
issue
would he
is
do?
matters.
That's the thing.
Yeah.
He's a big figure.
Well, the fact is, we spent
Well, he's not gonna
15
be a damp
minutes
squib,
talking
is he?
about him, and that is, to me, a sign.
Yeah.
And I think very likely Labour gets in, and at that point, although it's convenient, I think it's a nice phrase, that grafters and grifters, but Labour, also in the areas that I come from, like North West Durham, a lot of the North East seats, there's coastal seats, and then Clacton as you go south, Stella, and a bit of the south coast, you're going to have to kind of deal with people whose views of what's going to take them forward is not just what a kind of fairly orthodox recipe from the Labour Party. I think that will probably be good for Labour, but in a sense I would have a slightly more open ear.
And if he's rude in Parliament, as he was in the European Parliament, what's that going to achieve?
It was quite entertaining, though.
I don't. I
deep.
don't. I don't disagree.
Right.
But that's the challenge, isn't it, Alex? It's not actually that we're not listening. I listen very closely and intently. I'm horrified when I hear Nigel Farage being Islamophobic on Trevor Phillips' programme, because I see the damage it does in my local community, the people who are frightened that they're not welcome here, that their contribution isn't recognised.
But it does
it's just
allow
because
a
we're not
different voice in
agreeing doesn't
politics
mean we're
that's
not
very
listening.
destructive.
Right.
Reform's foreign policy is pretty questionable.
I have to say I'm not familiar with Reform's foreign policy, but
Withdrawal.
I don't want to upset you.
Well, I can imagine what it might be. Corey tells me I have to do the boring bit for the third time in the programme and tell you who the other candidates in Clacton are. The Liberal Democrats, Matthew Bensalem. Reform, obviously Nigel Farage. Green, Natasha Osben. Labour, Jovan Owusu Nepal. And Conservative Giles Watling. I have done my duty by electoral law and broadcasting regulations. More of your questions in just a moment. It's 17 minutes past 8.
Britain decides. Follow the general election and have your say only with LBC. Tom Question with Iain Dale on LBC. Call 0345 6060 973.
With me on the panel tonight, Stella Creasy from the Labour Party. I keep wanting to say MP, but I can't anymore because you're not an MP, are you?
You say co-op. I'm Labour and co-op.
Oh, OK, right.
That gives you the extra word.
OK, so Alan Duncan, former Conservative Foreign Office Minister and Lidl. Gina Miller... You didn't get that.
And
did
little.
you?
And
No,
little.
Lidl.
Oh.
If she's co-op, I just decide. See, when you have to explain a joke, it doesn't really work, does it?
Fortnum's, darling, Fortnum's.
Gina Miller, leader of the True and Fair Party, Anne McElvoy, broadcaster and executive editor at Politico Europe, and she presents the Power Play podcast. Right, Paul is in Manchester. Paul, what's your question, please?
Hello, everybody.
Hi, Paul.
Hello, everyone. In light of Kemi Badenoch's latest attack on trans women today, does this mean that trans men, basically biological women who change to men, with beards, who dress like men, who are on testosterone, who have male voices, does this mean that they should be immediately returned back to women's single-sex spaces, banned from men's single-sex spaces, and then how are women going to feel when they see trans men in their spaces and they don't know whether they're a trans man or a biological man?
Why do you say this is an attack on trans people? Because I saw her on the television this morning, and the way she explained it was that effectively they've got to clarify the law after the court case that involved the SNP. So the Tories are pledging to change the Equality Act to define the protected characteristic of sex as biological sex. Now, that's not an attack on trans people, is it, Paul?
It's an attack on. You didn't listen to my point. It's an attack on trans women, because the minute they start to attack trans men, the game's up for them, because attacking trans men is basically attacking biological women, and all this is supposedly about the protection of biological women. So trans men are biological women. So this isn't an attack on trans men, even though a lot of trans men are activists and annoyed about this. This is an attack on trans women. But I'm saying now, should trans men be returned back to women's spaces?
Okay, all right, we get the point. Stella?
Well, I think Paul's question reflects the mess that we've all got ourselves into. And at the heart of it, I'm acutely aware of two things. One, there is a very vulnerable community in this country. It's quite a small community, the trans community, that feels, and I think, frankly, understandably, under attack, because their very right to exist is being debated and contested. And these sorts of questions reflect that. And secondly, people need to be able to ask questions. They need to be able to understand what is going on, because this has now become such a heated debate, and there's a lot more heat than light. I didn't understand what Kemi Badenoch was doing today, to be honest, because actually there's already guidance from the HRC that covers some of the scenarios that people were talking about. You talk about that court case, you could probably issue statutory guidance to reconfirm that. But actually, what we all saw was what I was talking about earlier, that kind of let's find culture war issues, let's find ways to divide people, pick somebody to hold up and almost demonise. And I am acutely conscious that none of that tackles the very serious and real problem of violence against women that we have in our communities and our society. And I say that as somebody who does a huge amount of work on that. None of that answers that ability to navigate tricky, delicate situations. I trust service providers. That's what the law already allows them to do, and I trust them to do their job and to do their job well. I trust sporting bodies to be able to navigate what works for their sport, and I trust the vast majority of British people to recognise when they're being sold something to distract them from the state of this economy, and that's what the culture war is really about.
Well, I mean, I don't know whether, Alan, you're going to defend Kemi Badenoch, but I mean, what I heard her say today was on Politics Live, where she was on with Wes Streeting, and Wes seemed to kind of agree with her in the sense that the law does need to be clarified. But he said, well, why are you doing this in an election campaign for the reasons you've just pointed out? And she said, because we're being honest and saying the law needs to be clarified and this is how we're going to do it. And that's a perfectly reasonable thing to do during an election campaign.
But the law, they're not talking about changing the law, so they don't need to do what they've done. Come on, walks like a duck, talks like a duck. You can see this is day 12 of the day 11 of the election, and it's who are we offering up now to distract you from the state of the economy, and it is a perennial attack on trans people. It's not an understanding and recognition that there are challenges created by that court case about clarifying how the legislation should be applied. And let me be clear, I'm sitting here saying we absolutely have to have that conversation. We absolutely should be able to talk about where sex and gender intersect and what that means for service providers. Lots of service providers are doing it on the day. This coverage is about basically stopping people before they walk into toilets and asking them, about their sex or their gender. That isn't what the British public want and what the British public actually expect us to do.
I think a lot of the British public are rightly confused, and they want a more robust defence of single-sex spaces, and they may, some of them have got really reprehensible views on trans people, and that is to be condemned. But I think to say service providers can sort this out, sporting bodies, they are the very bodies that are most conflicted by this, and we see that one news story after another. So I don't think Kemi Badenoch's entirely wrong that this legislation needs clarification, but also that the public deserves the parties to be clear about it. And simply, I mean, sorry, Stella, because there are many things on which I do agree with you, but that I do think there's something a little bit odd and a little bit, I know you don't mean it this way, but I think it's a little bit too convenient, should we say, the Labour Party say, oh, come on, let's call out the Tories for daring to bring this up. People really want this to be brought up. We will probably have 4 different, maybe even 5 different views around this panel about it. But I'd rather that we're able to talk about it without it being treated as a bad faith argument that the Tories are just starting it when everyone would rather talk about the economy. They wouldn't. They want to talk about this.
The thing that slightly undermines Kemi Badenoch's case is that while she was giving that interview, or just beforehand, the Conservative Party Twitter feed put out a tweet saying Keir Starmer doesn't know what a woman is, Conservatives do. And that rather does feed into Stella's narrative. I mean, Alan, let's come to you.
I've found this issue very difficult because people get very, very exercised about it, and yet 90% probably of the country say, for God's sake, I don't understand it. It does my head in. I can't understand it all. But it does matter, and there must be enormous sympathy for those for whom this is very, very important, and probably the most important thing in their life. So the language and I think the law both have to be extremely clear. And I think what I heard Kemi Badenoch on the Today programme this morning, and I was trying to understand exactly what she was saying, because I find a lot of this very complicated. But basically, I think what she was saying is that your biological sex should determine where you can mix and all that kind of stuff. But just dressing as a different person should not. So I can't see anything particularly wrong with that, even though that latter category needs proper understanding and proper sensitivity, particularly when they're young and in their formative years. And I really, look, please, I don't think this was an attempt as a distraction, the culture war. I mean, in 6 weeks of a campaign, you have to fill space with all of the issues which you think people are exercised about, and inevitably this is one of them. And I think that it's caused a lot of heat and concern, obviously particularly in Scotland over the last couple of years. And I think it's quite proper that the person, the minister responsible for it, should say, well, this is our thinking. And I think that was all right.
But that isn't what she did, Alan. And what the consequence of this, the question for all of us, is what happens to gender recognition certificates. Because as the law stands in this country, you don't have to have had body modification to secure a gender recognition certificate. Now, in some other countries, they have gone down that route. What I want to see, if I think this isn't actually about the general election, this is a genuine attempt to address the debate that has been happening for some time, and believe me, I've been stuck in the middle of it and heard the heat and light from all the sides, then you need to be honest about what you mean to happen to people with gender recognition certificates. Because a gender recognition certificate should affect how you are treated if it is a meaningful piece of paperwork. And that, if you heard the Today programme, you heard Michelle saying, also asking her, well, what does this mean for paperwork? And Kemi Badenoch tied herself up in knots, because either they don't want to be honest that basically they want to completely destroy the gender recognition certificate process. I think that is a matter for Parliament to have that debate, because we had a debate, we had a piece of legislation passed, and people may feel it does or it doesn't work.
Yeah, we're about to elect Parliament.
Right. Or what she's doing is feeding into a debate online.
But Stella, I think Stella's just put her finger on it, in that it should be a debate in Parliament, because it is actually an important issue, especially amongst young people. Whenever I'm going out talking to young people, this is something that they really get emotionally upset about, and the way that politicians talk about it, because these are vulnerable people, and these are people that they are meeting in their everyday lives, because they're much freer about the way they talk about gender and trans and, how the freedoms they want to live their lives with and the choices. And you could look back and say maybe the conversations we had 40, 50 years ago about homosexuality is what's happening now with young people with trans. But, it will move on, this debate. But to have it now in the middle of a general election, I do think is poisoning the well when it comes to a very emotional and delicate debate. I understand that the law...
Where would you have it? Every European country in election year is having this debate. Everyone that I ever go to.
Are they?
Yes, they are. Yeah,
So Anne, in a election campaign, things get sloganised and spun and made into gimmicks. This is too serious an issue and too delicate an issue to have. And I think that, yes, there are two things. One is the law needs to be clarified, and that's what the court case was. And then there needs to be an update on that. We accept that into the Equalities Act. But then beyond that, there has to be a much wider debate, because this affects really serious issues like prisons, who's going into which prison.
Sure.
When this is a very, very...
And,
this has
rightly so, 'cause
ramifications.
it's about risk assessment.
It has ramifications across all sections of society, in schools to prisons to university to everything. So let us not make it about something that's a gimmick, and that's what I'm worried about.
I find it astonishing that here we are electing a parliament where the people are making a choice, and Gina is saying there are some topics that can't be discussed. Every topic should be discussed.
I'm not saying... I don't think it should be discussed in this way. And that's a problem, I think, that's happening. There's a danger that in an electoral cycle that it will get subsumed by a lot of the PR, if you like, or the marketing that happens during a campaign.
The challenge here, Alan, is not that there isn't a debate that needs to happen. We all recognise, because these court cases have happened, actually what they've done is reinforce that the Equalities Act does allow, in those circumstances, to make the differentiation. But absolutely, it's now become a widespread concern that it might not. The question is, what she came up with today was not a policy. And actually what we should all want in a general election campaign is for policies to be scrutinised, because she wasn't honest about what it will mean for gender recognition certificates. And if you want to rip up gender recognition certificates, then you need to be honest as to why that's what you want to do.
How far do you take that? Because, I mean, you said, well, look, we've all got to be sensible about this. But I mean, at the moment, the prison service, for example, I mean, to my mind, the common sense approach to that is if you have a penis, you don't go into a women's prison. I mean, it's as simple as that. And yet that isn't the policy.
No, and that is why everyone's saying, look, there does need to be clarity, but it could be done through statutory guidance. There would be support to do that, to recognise actually one of the biggest... I mean, there's a whole big conversation about reform of women's prisons. The Corsten Review, actually longer than that, 20 years ago now, set that debate up. That has never happened. So I see women being failed by our prison system in many ways. And actually the question about what you do with transgender prisoners is just a part of that. But that's not the conversation that was put out today. And that's what I think we're all reacting to.
Stella, isn't it fair for any of your constituents, would-be constituents, let's say at the hustings, to ask you as a candidate if you agree with what Iain has just said?
Absolutely. And in fact, tomorrow I'm having discussions with local residents who want to raise these things. So I want to be really, really crystal clear.
So why can't Kemi Badenoch say it on
Because that's
television?
not what she did today.
I think
Come on, Alan. We can all hear a dog whistle when it's whistled. And that is what happened today. And that tweet proves that exactly. And actually what's really sad about this is we need to get this right.
OK. It may be unfair, but we need to go to the news headlines on LBC at 8:32 with Daryl Jackson.
The Defence Secretary Grant Shapps has told LBC voting Conservative is the only way to keep Labour out of power after Nigel Farage announced he'll stand as an MP. Sir Keir Starmer's insisted he would be prepared to use nuclear weapons if necessary. The Conservatives want to clarify the legal definition of sex and gender. 500,000 people have been left without their child benefit payments as a result of an issue at HMRC. Around 30% of payments haven't been made as a result. And the wife of Rob Burrow says she is incredibly proud and fortunate to call him her husband. The former Leeds Rhinos player died, aged 41, after being diagnosed with motor neuron disease in 2019. LBC weather, some drizzle in the west and the north tonight and a low of 6 degrees.
LBC.
Here
Question with Iain Dale on LBC. Text 84850.
8:35. We have with us on the panel tonight Anne McElvoy, broadcaster and executive editor at Politico Europe. She presents the podcast Power Play. There's so many political podcasts.
Yeah, but this Power Play is actually an interview show, so it's kind of better value.
Who's your latest one?
Really interesting interview still out this week with the American ambassador Jane Hartley, which she basically pointed to the split over what to do about that recommendation to basically to refer Israel to the International Criminal Court, and the split that's caused at the top of Labour between Keir Starmer and David Lammy, which I'm sure wasn't entirely welcome listening there for those involved. She made very clear that she sort of backed Keir Starmer, who she believes is against this, over David Lammy. So you see, we make better news, we do stuff. And we've got very interesting one of the Trump advisors this week. I'm going to keep that secret till Thursday, but actually it's like another reason I maybe don't quite agree with what Stella said at the start. I think there's a lot of threat and recklessness in Donald Trump, but make no mistake, I interview a lot of the people around him. They are actually quite serious policy advisors who believe that he's going to get
thank
in.
Goodness for
and
that.
they've got
something.
Well, yeah, but also they have very different views to me on some things. But I think they're quite on defence and security.
Also with us, Gina Miller, leader of the True and Fair Party. She doesn't have time for a podcast, do you, Gina?
No, I definitely don't.
Very good, actually.
And if Alan Duncan did a podcast, I would listen to it.
That's very kind of you.
You wouldn't listen to mine.
It wouldn't make news.
And Stella Creasy doesn't have a podcast.
I do.
Oh, you do?
I do.
And you don't listen to it.
No, you don't
No,
listen to
I've
it.
never heard of it. What's it
It's
called?
called The Mumifesto, and it's about how the impact of parenting on politics.
That's a bloody good
That's
idea.
a nice name. I
a
like
very
that.
good idea.
Well done.
You're all very welcome to be on
Yes.
it, because,
I don't have children. I just
But that's, you
Yeah,
don't
you
have to.
have
That's
to.
the point.
Yeah,
The point
you
is
don't have
about
to.
All right.
how
That's a
the
good idea.
impact
Okay.
of your family
Right,
life
let's
affects
go
your
on to a
kids.
very important question. It's a text question from Mike, who says, Keir Starmer says his new changed Labour Party is now the party of national security. Do you agree? Now, Starmer said he would be prepared to use nuclear weapons if needed to defend the UK as he set out Labour's defence plans. Gina Miller.
Well, there's no denying that we're going into an increasingly unstable world, in Europe and even further afield. And so we do need to think very seriously about the defence of our country. And it's something that's been neglected, I think, in politics for quite some time. And you really have to have that conversation now. And I hope we can believe what he's saying, because it's not just about nuclear, it's also about cyber and about all the other things. When you listen to the depletion of our armed forces and the hardware and the software, you just think, what happened? This has been neglected. Our country's safety has been neglected for, government after government in the last 20 years. And I think that's now, it's serious. It's serious, and we have to look at a 2.5% defence budget. But also, I think, and Alan probably thinks of this, it's not just all about our defence budget. It's also about our foreign policy. Because at one time, our soft power in the world was significant. So it's not just the hardware and software. It's also about rebuilding trust so that we can be taken seriously and use that soft power again.
Yeah, I think our foreign policy reputation has rather plummeted over the last few years. To some extent, David Cameron has restored it a little bit, but hasn't had time. I think, in answer to your question, I'd say this. Major parties, all parliamentarians need to appreciate that the foundation of any defence and security capability is adherence to international law. And that means you must believe in international law properly and not just think you can pick and choose the bits you like or dislike. And that means that the attacks on the United Nations, I think, have been pretty despicable. And we, as one of the P5, should be a fervent defender of the United Nations and not a country which can duck what the United Nations properly wants to do on some of the very difficult issues across the world. On the defence side, yes, we're going to have to spend more money. But let's try and have a sensible debate about this too, because it's not just about soldier numbers. We now can perhaps do much more with 10 high-tech people with 100 drones sitting in a control centre just outside London than we can with an aircraft carrier going around the East Pacific or something. So we have to, in the same way as we've had to revise all kind of activities with the modern technology of the internet and everything else, do the same with defence. So it's about capability, yes, a budget, but we shouldn't be locked in some kind of fossilised time warp to think it's all about soldiers in uniform marching across a parade ground.
What about the answer to the question, though, about Keir Starmer?
Well, whether he believes in...
Well, the question is, Keir Starmer says his new Change Labour Party is now the party of national security. Do you agree?
Not if he picks and chooses international law. He has never been properly...
Has he shown any sign of doing that?
Well, he's never been properly questioned on foreign policy, and he's ducked everything, I think, on the difficulties of Gaza. And I think in the 4 weeks or so we've got left on this election, he needs to be asked some serious questions about that. I think one has to admit, though, that in not challenging the nuclear deterrent and saying that it will remain and properly, you have to admit that this is a change, and it's a change for the better. And compared with Jeremy Corbyn, you have to recognise that that's the case.
But Stella, just on that, the Shadow Foreign Secretary, David Lammy, he's on record as recently as 2016 being against the renewal of Trident. 47 Labour MPs, so a quarter of Labour MPs, also agree with David Lammy. Some people might suggest that therefore the security of the nation isn't safe in Labour's hands.
But I think all of us probably are multilateral disarmists. I mean, all of us, and Alan is nodding. What this is a recognition that the world we are now living in. I'm very conscious that Donald Tusk, I think you're absolutely right, we're underplaying what's happening in Europe. Donald Tusk has said that we are on the brink of war across Europe right now. This is a very uncertain situation. And it is a truism that the first duty of any government, or even government in waiting, is to keep its citizens safe. So what Keir has done today is put beyond doubt that question about, well, actually, in a world that is this uncertain, what I hear is that, those conversations that were happening, Gordon Brown did huge amounts of work towards multilateral disarmament. That was a different era. We are now in a world with a huge number of threats and destabilisation. I don't disagree with you, actually, Anne, that there are lots of very serious people around Trump. What I see around him is his inability to engage with those people in the same way that I see around Putin, that I see in Iran, that I see in China, that actually you can have a plutocratic
Yeah, but the
situation.
people around him will affect the Western Security Compact in a way that the other autocracies will not. They will.
Well,
either they will keep backing Ukraine or they won't keep backing Ukraine. They will turn to China first or Iran first. So who wins that battle around Trump really matters for our defence and security.
Absolutely. And that's, I guess, the second point to make about all of this is that we are not alone. We are interconnected. And what Keir also did today was make that commitment to NATO that, yes, under previous Labour leaders has not been made. And that is absolutely right, because we cannot and should not act alone. Where I also, this is frightening me, Anne.
It's very
I don't know who's moved.
It's very good for your soul and your...
But you're right about you cannot do it solely on... Defence is also about the proactive work that you are doing to prevent and de-escalate the threats and risks. And we've seen that in the Red Sea. We've seen that inability to collaborate. But we've also seen that we need to be able to address situations like the situation in Israel and Gaza. We need to address the impact of Iran. We need to think about what the world's relationship with China is. Those are questions that, again, dominate the next 5 years.
Khaled has texted this. What will the implications be for the major parties in the general election for not having voted for a ceasefire in Gaza? Anne?
Difficult for Labour, very difficult for Labour. And I was obviously doing a bit of, promoting my latest podcast.
Is it on the podcast?
It's on the podcast. But no, it was actually really surprised me, to be honest. I mean, I'm very happy to talk about anything on the podcast. But American Ambassador Jane Hartley, she's very convivial, she's very smooth. She's obviously a Biden appointee. And for her to kind of basically point out, and she wasn't trying to make trouble, she was just saying, actually, when I asked her, she said, well, yes, I see that David Lammy has made this recommendation that you basically get really tough on Israel, refer them to the International Criminal Court. She basically made very clear she didn't agree with that, and she said, I don't think Keir Starmer, she said, he has not said anything on this matter, and that does point to a difference of opinion. This is what is going to happen. I mean, I know that Alan has a particular view on Gaza. I probably see the pressures and incentives on Israel a bit differently, but any government, we talked about grown-up governments, responsible governments, is going to be faced with this issue. That's only one angle of it. It's particularly difficult for Labour, isn't it? Because no sooner had they just about got through the anti-Semitism sort of clear out, then the situation in the Middle East becomes very complicated after this dreadful Hamas attack in Israel. And I think it's very complex in Labour's, if you like, sociology in a way it isn't for the Tories.
I think anti-Semitism and the issue of Gaza and Israel are distinct. And I think that, I mean, of course, this wasn't the only cause, but the attack on October the 7th by Hamas to a small extent, represents a massive failure of Western politics, in that no pressure in the couple of years beforehand had been put on the growing extremism of Netanyahu, and indeed no support was given to the moderates who were fast becoming the majority in Israel and indeed in Palestine. And instead, everyone was sort of sucking up to Netanyahu. And the next thing you get is this auction of extremes where you have this disgusting atrocity, which I think could have been avoided if pressure had been put on Netanyahu earlier.
I think you're very suggestible.
That's exactly right.
One at a time.
Let's be very clear. Responsibility for what happened on October the 7th.
I said that.
It's with Hamas.
Yeah, I'm talking about
I agree with you that one of the failures in that situation is the political leadership in Israel and in Palestine. And I'm somebody who voted consistently
And the West.
for a ceasefire because I wanted that to be our priority and the message that we were sending to the Israeli government. And I want to be really clear about the distinction between the Israeli people and the Israeli government.
And there's one more
point,
point,
there is a huge
if I
amount
may.
of opposition to Netanyahu.
very quickly.
But I
Just-
don't think we should downplay.
It didn't start on October the 7th. The root cause is Israel taking Palestinian land every single day.
but I sit-
That's,
no
I
problem.
think that-
No,
and I think
no,
that's
no,
the
no,
point,
Gina
isn't
hasn't
it?
had a word
But
to
that's,
you
that's
yet.
the point,
Gina.
isn't it? I think that's what I'm saying, that actually, as an international community, we should have acted sooner on what was going on with the taking of land and the encroachment of Israel on Gaza. And I think that's what we're saying
On the
at
West
the moment,
Bank,
on the
right.
West Bank. But at the same time, you know, it was a terrorist organisation that went in on the 7th of October, and we can't forget that. But, you know, but at the same, there has to be, and there should have been, in my view, much more pressure from the international community to have a ceasefire before this, because the humanitarian disaster that's happened there is inexcusable.
Gina, we don't have anything called LBC Verify on this channel, but we have our listeners to fact check. And one of our listeners, Stu, says the United States is once again the world's soft power superpower, topping the latest global soft power index. The UK sits in second place. China's ranked third, surpassing Japan and Germany. So we're not doing too badly on the soft power.
We're not doing too badly, but where we need to be is at the top. And I think at the moment,
we're second.
well, no, if you think about it, we're not trusted. I mean, around the world,
We clearly are, judging by this.
Well, I don't think if you
I
go
think
and
since the
speak,
crisis
if you
in Ukraine,
speak,
we are more trusted.
I was going to say that in Ukraine we are, but when you look at what's happening, if you speak to people abroad, they do look in at us and think, what's going on?
Well, just giving
we
you the
did
facts
have a
there.
prime minister who couldn't decide whether France was a friend or foe in recent.
But also we've had
did.
5 prime
And
ministers in the space of...
Stella, you
that
should be doing
strips
my
our
job, because
representation.
that is, or the subject of what you've just said, is going to be the subject of our next question. So
subject
hold
of
your
your- I was gonna say
fire.
subject of your
Hold
podcast.
your fire. It's 8:48.
This is LBC.
Listeners.
Question with Iain Dale on LBC.
Stella Creasy, Sir Alan Duncan, Gina Miller and Anne McElvoy all with us. Alan, since you've been knighted, do people treat you differently?
They think I'm taller.
Does it help you get a better table in a restaurant?
I never had a problem getting a decent table.
Right.
As Ed Arger, who's the Minister for Justice, said in his maiden speech, well, I've known him for 20 years, and can I assure the House that the nights are getting shorter?
Very good. Right, let's go to Martin in Doncaster. Hello, Martin.
Hello, Iain and panel, and
Hi.
welcome back. Welcome back as well, Iain.
Thank you.
Should Liz Truss be given the award for being the worst PM ever?
Now, in an interview last week, Liz Truss said that title should go to Tony Blair. Controversial or what, Stella Creasy?
I've been on your show before and talked about the opposite of imposter syndrome being trustivance, because she has a level of self-confidence, self-belief that she must need to get through the day if she thinks in those sorts of ways. Actually, I'm not going to... I know it's become a figure of fun, and every single person you talk to who's now paying the price of it in their mortgage does not think any of this is funny. But I just think we all need to move on from Liz Truss. I think, she don't entertain her, don't indulge her. I mean, for goodness sake, it's just sad, actually, that there's this level of... So I'm much more concerned about, frankly, what some of the other Conservatives... And as I say this as somebody who is, a Democrat as well as a socialist, to see the Conservative Party in the condition it's in. I've always been very ideological, not tribal, so I'm passionate about my ideas, and I want there to be people that you argue with and debate with, because that's how you get good policy from. Actually watching the Conservative Party deteriorate in this way to the point where Liz Truss can say things like that and it gets coverage actually makes me sort of worry for the future, because it makes people think that democracy doesn't matter. It does matter. There are choices to be made and decisions to be made, and not lettuces to be voted for.
Alan, I can't remember. Were you a Foreign Office Minister when Liz Truss was Foreign Secretary?
No, I was
didn't have that pleasure.
It was even more exciting because I was under Boris Johnson and then Jeremy Hunt. But I have to say, in answer to your question, I've suddenly seen the advantage of the old Soviet technique of airbrushing someone out of history. I, in my more sort of cheeky moments, I refer to her as the spasm, who was just sort of suddenly popped up and then disappeared again. And it's an embarrassment.
Alan, you
there is
can't
a
call
really
it the
serious...
hernia of the Conservative Party.
To your point, though, Stella, this is really serious, because actually a proper functioning democracy needs a proper functioning opposition. Yeah. And at the moment, we don't have that. And that's what is really worrying, because then what we move to is an autocracy. We actually don't have...
We are about to have a one-party state.
Yeah, we are about to have a one-party state. And, and that's what I think is really sad about, what we're facing as we go forwards without a proper opposition. In these reminders that when Liz Truss pops up and says these things, just damages people's faith even more. I mean, look, people are just so fed up of remembering, the damage to the country and then reinventing it and blaming other people and saying it was their fault and that she wasn't listened to, she wasn't given enough time. Just go and do something else.
Okay, Anne.
Yeah, I don't think she's doing herself any favours with that kind of sort of just trying to say, more and more sort of shock Jill stuff. Because, it's pretty clear, whatever you thought of Tony Blair, if you're a sort of dominant figure in the history of the Labour Party, much to the chagrin of many people in the Labour Party, must be said. But, the fact is he was a considerable Prime Minister, and if you've served for a very short amount of time, then maybe you should not draw attention to that comparison. I think it's a bit of a shame that she's going that way, because I did always quite enjoy her sort of challenge, particularly to some of the orthodoxies of the Treasury, to the Office of Budgetary Responsibility, who often come from the same sort of eggshell. And I think we kind of need a bit more of that in the system. I think she has a sort of interesting economic analysis that she was obviously trying to bring to bear in a very cack-handed way, and it didn't work out. And in a way, I think she should just keep applying that, talking about it. If she starts to go off all the time talking about the deep state, the Financial Times is the deep state and Tony Blair is the worst Prime Minister, then I think she's going to get a very, very, very late night
economists who actually backed her
nuts.
policy.
She's so
crazy.
simplistic. As if to say, I've got all these ideas that are going to happen now. I mean, politics is the art of the possible.
Sequencing.
And as if you're and rolling the pitch so that people can then accept the arguments and understand them and everything. It's as if she was standing on the white cliffs of Dover and saw a beautiful beach underneath and thought that instead of looking at the path going down to the left, the best way to get to it was to take one big step forward.
Okay.
And that's what she did.
Let's exclude Liz Truss from this competition,
Oh, yes.
and indeed Tony Blair. Going back to Sir Robert Walpole in 1721,
Bad Prime
who
Ministers.
do you think has been our worst ever Prime Minister?
Well, you could say Eden, couldn't you, in the sense if you're like me, you see that there are more dangers in appeasement and probably some of the dividing lines around what we do about in the international troubled position at the moment tend to fall, not very crassly, but along those lines. I mean, he was a considerable politician in many other ways, but if you talk about a major misjudgment of a period in history, I think you'd probably say that until he's replaced by Churchill, yeah.
Stella?
I mean, I'm not going to disagree with you mainly because at this point I bow to your superior. I'm sure you've written books on this, haven't you?
Strangely, I have, yes.
All good.
Thank you for the plug,
exactly.
Stella. You can come back.
Please don't.
What about Ramsay MacDonald? Some people in Labour think he was bad.
Well,
but on the other hand, he had also an interesting but he made that fatal decision, didn't you, of going into coalition?
See, a lot of people say Lord North because we lost the colonies under Lord North. But if you look at his domestic record, he was actually a rather good Prime Minister.
He was quite progressive.
Alan?
It's funny. I've met every Prime Minister since Macmillan,
Wow.
and I'm going to look at all of them and think who is the best and the worst. I think Stella will disagree with me, but although he had enormous qualities and was a formidable Chancellor, Gordon Brown was not a good Prime Minister. I think that his lack of personal understanding and communication skills just meant that he was a very, very strong number two, but weaker as a number one. I wouldn't say it was a disaster.
Doesn't this then go back to the discussion we were having at the start here about what do we ask of our politicians? And on all sides, it's increasingly about show business for ugly people and being entertained rather than
It also means you've got to win an election, and you
but
didn't.
also,
But actually, we need to. I mean, come on. We all recognise this is a country at a crossroads. It does want something different, but the difference shouldn't just be about is it entertaining.
No, you're right.
Well, I
It's
wasn't
got
saying
to be
that. I
about
wasn't saying that.
enlightening.
I think the point about Gordon Brown is that he became Prime Minister at the fag end of a long government.
Yeah.
And if you look back in history and look at other Prime Ministers in similar positions, virtually none of them are regarded as good Prime Ministers now. We're running out of time.
But I was
Gina.
going to say,
Genuinely think
nobody's
that's unfair
mentioned
to
Boris
Gordon as
Johnson,
well.
which
Yeah.
I find extraordinary.
Oh, I forgot about him.
Yeah, I was going to say, how could you not... Boris Johnson, in my view, is the worst Prime Minister
But you
we've
see, with
had.
Boris Johnson, there are pluses as well as minuses. And
Really?
I mean, Ukraine, for example, I think surely we can all agree that he actually did a rather good job on Ukraine.
I think he and his government did a good job. I wouldn't say necessarily
Well,
it was
he
just
he-
him.
he-
He led
he
the
was- he led
government
it.
very early on this issue.
Yeah.
I know
Right.
it's painful,
Okay.
Gina, but it's
Okay.
true.
No. I'm not saying
It was
that.
his
Danny.
rescue
It's fine.
pack.
He was his rescue back.
Let's go to our fun question to finish with. It's from yeah, exactly. It's from Molly. Which political figure do you think should go on this year's Love Island as the bombshell?
Oh my goodness, what's a bombshell?
Surprise, I think. Anne just pointed at Hunky Dunky.
Thank you, darling. Shall we go together?
Shall we go together? That's great. What a good idea.
So do
You
they
saved
just
me
sort
an
of
answer.
send somebody as
Send a politician onto Love Island.
Oh, God.
Who do you think would do well there?
Easy.
Go on.
Stella.
Absolutely.
Go
I
on,
was going to
say yes.
say, I was going to
Stella,
say,
I've not seen
I
Love
thought
Island, so I
Ian
don't
had
know.
pulled out of selection so that he was available. But surely it's time for George Galloway to go back.
Yes,
round
he
two.
loves those sorts of things, doesn't he?
I mean, that cat
That
impression
cat, I
is
was just
probably
thinking
the
of that.
only positive contribution he's made to this country.
Very disappointing answers there. Thank you all very much indeed. Stella Creasy, Sir Alan Duncan, Gina Miller and Anne McElvoy. Coming up in the next hour, we're going to ask what is essentially quite a simple question. Which party do you trust most on defence? And the reason we're asking that is because Sir Keir Starmer made a big speech this morning touting Labour's wares on defence policy. He said the party had changed. They'd ditched all the policies from the Corbyn era, and this was very different. The Conservatives traditionally have been the party that has got most support on the issue of defence, but when you look at the state of the armed forces at the moment, you have to wonder how that could have happened under a Conservative government, don't you? 0345 6060 973 is the number to call, as ever, here on LBC.
On your radio, on Global Player, and
Play LBC.
leading Britain's conversation. This is LBC.
From Global's newsroom at 9 o'clock, Nigel Farage has announced he will be the new leader of Reform UK and is standing in the election. Speaking at a campaign event in London, he says people are currently rejecting the political class. Anne Widdecombe, Justice spokesperson for Reform UK, told LBC this has added some excitement.
This has changed everything from a rather dull hum to a great mighty roar. It has electrified the campaign, it has put some spark into it. I think most people, whether they like Farage or not, agree with that.
Labour's been laying out its plans for defence, while the Tories want to clarify the legal definition of sex and gender. The Lib Dems have promised to clean up the UK's waterways, and the SNP says it will stop the NHS being privatised. HMRC says it's solved an issue with child benefit payments. Around 500,000 people haven't received theirs as planned today and will now get them on Wednesday. Israel's confirmed the deaths of 4 hostages held in Gaza. It's understood British-Israeli 51-year-old Nadav Popplewell is among them. The Royal College of Nursing says the issue of hospital overcrowding now amounts to a national emergency. Its survey of frontline staff found 2 in 5 nurses delivered care in inappropriate areas, including corridors, during their most recent shift. The Acting General Secretary, Nicola Ranger, says it's unacceptable.
How can we call examining patients in a public space where they feel exposed, vulnerable and violated care? One place even had to unplug the vending machine to fit in a patient.
NHS England says it provided an extra 5,000 beds last year. A man's in hospital with potentially life-changing injuries after being bitten by a suspected registered XL bully dog in Bristol. Officers were called to Knoll yesterday morning. A woman's been arrested and bailed on suspicion of having a dog dangerously out of control. And a man's admitted running onto the pitch at Wembley during the Champions League final as part of a prank. He's been banned from football matches in the UK for 3 years. In the city, the FTSE 100 has closed down 8 points at 82.66. The pound buys $1.27 and €1.17. Weather, some drizzle in the west and the north tonight, turning windy with heavy rain in the northwest near dawn and a low of 6 degrees. From Global's newsroom for LBC, I'm Daryl Jackson.
This is LBC from Global, leading Britain's conversation with Iain Dale.
Hello, a very good evening. It's 4 minutes past 9 on LBC. Let's talk about what I think should be one of the biggest political issues in the election campaign. And Sir Keir Starmer effectively put it front and centre of the election campaign today when he said he would be prepared to use nuclear weapons if needed to defend the UK as he set